Hello, this is Phil Candreva. This video is intended to provide an empirical foundation for the course, where we'll look at some data on the federal budget and national security budgets for the United States. Here's our agenda. We're going to start by talking about budget structure, and then we'll dive into some data that has its roots in the Constitution of the United States. In Article 1, Section 8, that defines the powers of Congress, it says Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes to do three things: to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and provide for the general welfare of the United States. So we'll be looking at all of these areas of the budget. We'll then dive into the defense budget a little bit and look at some allocations and trends within national defense spending. And we'll end by looking at the timeliness of the appropriations that we receive each year. Human beings struggle to imagine large numbers. And in this video, we're going to talk about some very, very large numbers. So to help you conceive of those big numbers, if you imagine that a millimeter is equal to $1 million, and many of you can probably imagine what $1 million is. You might even have $1 million in the bank. Or maybe your house is valued at $500,000 or $1 million. But there are 25 millimeters in an inch. A meter, which is about a yard long, would then be 1,000 millimeters or 1,000 million or $1 billion. And a kilometer, which is 6/10 of a mile, would then be $1 trillion. If you've ever run a 5K, then $5 trillion is like running a 5K, where there is $1 million laying on the ground every millimeter. Or for every average stride that you take, you're stepping over $160 million. The budget of the United States is structured in four main ways. And we're going to take a look at each of those four in turn. First, the budget's structured based on budget function. In other words, why are you asking for this money? What function of government is being performed with these funds? And there's a number scheme for these functions of government. 050 is national defense, 150 is international affairs, and so on. You can see the chart here. And what's shown are the budget requests for fiscal year 2022 and 2023 to give you a sense of scale among these various functions of government. The total being about $5.5 to $6 trillion. Now we could take these functions of government and display them in a pie chart. So let's start with fiscal year 2021, which was submitted to Congress just before COVID became a thing. And so you could consider it our last normal budget. And here is the budget in descending order by size of budget function. And the total budget was just over $5 trillion. And what you'll notice here is that 88% of that federal budget performed only four basic functions. It provided some form of income support. And those are the two big blue wedges: Social Security and income security. And the largest piece of income security in most years are retirements for federal employees. Second, it included some form of health care, the red and pink wedges, which are Medicare, and the healthcare wedge, which is mostly Medicaid, but also includes things like the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, and those kinds of functions. Third are the green wedges, national defense and veterans benefits. And fourth is the orange wedge, interest on the debt. That means that everything else the federal government does, highways, airports, Homeland Security, immigration, justice, the FBI, Congress, the White House, NASA, agriculture, all of that is only 12%. of the federal budget. Now, COVID had a significant impact on the federal budget. We didn't spend $5 trillion in fiscal year 2021. We spent $7.14 trillion in fiscal year 2021, and most of the increase was in those two wedges with the star, healthcare and income security. If you got one of those or two of those or three of those stimulus checks, you were in that income security wedge, which led us to a FY22 budget that looked a little different from FY21. And we see that income security had jumped up to second place. Healthcare and Medicare were both ahead of national defense, which fell into fifth place. The total budget was $6.2 trillion. And this budget also included the first year of the Build Back Better plan proposed by the Biden administration. Estimated actual spending for fiscal year 22 is much lower than what was budgeted because COVID expenses were less than anticipated and the major infrastructure investments were not appropriated. The fiscal year 23 budget is largely a return to the pre-pandemic normal. Totals about $5.9 trillion. 89% of the budget is in the big four categories: income support, healthcare, defense and veterans, and servicing the national debt. So in addition to structuring the budget by function, we also structure the budget by agency, answering the question, who is asking for the money and will be managing it? And this chart shows the estimates from the FY23 budget and some years before and after for four of the major national security functions, or agencies, I guess, organizations in our government. It's important to note that the functions of government do not have a one-to-one mapping to the agencies of government. There are some things in the national security function of government that are not done by the Department of Defense. The Department of Homeland Security, for instance, falls into multiple functions of government, from transportation to administration of justice. So a given function could be supported by multiple agencies, and a given agency may support multiple functions. So in addition to why are you asking for the money and who is asking for the money, we also ask, what are you going to do with the money? And here we have what are called objects of expense, or object classifications. And this is a structure that's universal across the federal government. Every agency will put their budget together by requesting funds in each of these categories. And if we were to look at the entire federal government, we could see how much is expected to be spent in each of those categories. And the fourth way we structure the budget is by appropriation. How do we want those funds, that budget authority, to be given to us by Congress? And here's an example of the Department of Defense budget seeking funding for military personnel Navy, military personnel Marine Corps, and it actually includes there in italic print in the upper right the language that the administration would like to see in the Appropriations Act. We actually write the law for Congress in the way we would like to see it enacted. Of course, they have full authority to edit that and change it before they appropriate the money. So the first point I want to make with this video is budget structures are presented in various ways because they support different kinds of decisions. Why do you need the money? Who's getting the money? What are you buying with the money? And how do you want that money provided? And this assists Congress in making these various decisions. The federal budget falls into lots of different categories, but for our purposes, there's two. And we'll talk about mandatory and discretionary spending. And the definition of those words, as you would read them in a dictionary, are not the same as the way they are used in the budget. So without getting into some really technical details, I think the best way to think about this is that there is one thing that's variable and one thing that's fixed. We have a dollar amount and a programmatic definition. So for mandatory spending, we fix the programmatic definition and we allow the dollar amount to vary. For example, Social Security is in the mandatory category of the budget. And what is fixed in terms of that programmatic definition is the formula for determining how much you get and the rules for determining whether or not you get anything. So you could retire early, say at age 62, and you get X number of dollars based on this formula, or you could retire on time at age 65 or 67, depending upon how old you are, and you get a different amount of money based on a formula, or you could wait and receive the benefits later, and there's formulas to dictate that. And so what Congress does is appropriate the formula and the rules for eligibility, and the dollar amount will go up or down depending upon the number and type of people who apply for this program. Discretionary spending works the opposite way, that we fix the dollar amount and allow the level of programmatic activity to vary based upon the amount of funding that's provided. And we do that because there is no algorithm, there is no formula for a unit of justice or a unit of security. And so we have portions of the budget that we say, hey, the best we can do, because we don't have an algorithm, is to decide how much money we think is appropriate, go buy as much justice or as much national security as you can with that amount of money. The other big difference between these two is that mandatory spending is fixed in semi-permanent law. And I say semi-permanent because Congress can, at their discretion, change those rules and those algorithms whenever they want. They just don't do it very often because stability in these programs is valued as good public policy. We don't want the formula for our retirement benefit to change from year to year. Discretionary spending is appropriated on an annual basis. So let's look at the distribution of resources in the federal budget among these two categories. The largest discretionary part of the budget is national defense. And on this chart that reaches back about 60 years, defense has gone from about half of the federal budget down to about 1/6 of the federal budget. Then there are some non-defense discretionary programs like State Department, Department of Justice, those kinds of things, that's shown in the light green. Dark blue is Social Security, medium blue is healthcare, light blue are other mandatory programs, and red is interest on the national debt. This chart is done on a percentage basis, and you can see the range on the right-hand side in the current allocation. Note in 2020 and 2021 the significant increase in other mandatory programs as a response to the pandemic. We can look at the same data in inflation-adjusted dollar terms. And here's what we see. There's national defense, other discretionary, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory, and interest on the debt. So you look at this chart and you think, my goodness, defense sure has decreased in its share of the federal budget from 50% down to about 1/6 or 1/7. But you'll also notice that there's a whole lot more money on the right-hand side of this chart than the left. And so if we were to make the pies proportional to the size of the economy and the size of the federal budget, when DOD was half the budget, that was a little 6-inch personal pan pizza. Now that it's about 1/7 of the budget, that's a 16-inch extra large pie. And it's actually more pizza than it was back when you had only half of that little pan pizza. The other thing to be cognizant of is when we talk about budgets, we often talk about different numbers. Sometimes we talk about what was requested in the budget. Sometimes we talk about what was appropriated by Congress in response to that budget, which is typically a different number. We might be talking about what is our authority to obligate, which could differ from the appropriation if we have, say, reprogrammed or transferred some money around. Or we may be looking at the actual outlays, how much actually left the Treasury in paying an invoice or paying somebody's salary. So if you look at this chart from the 2023 budget, that budget requested $5.9 trillion in new authority, of which they expected $4.4 trillion to outlay during 2023. So these would be Social Security checks that went out, paychecks that went out, contract payments that went out. And the remaining $1.49 trillion would outlay in future years. This would be a contract to buy a fighter aircraft that was placed in 2023, but it isn't paid for until the aircraft is delivered in 2025 or 2026. So if part of the 2023 budget will outlay in future years, we can expect some prior year appropriations to carry into the current year. And we see that in the lower left. Unspent authority enacted in prior years, we brought about $4 trillion into the current year, into 2023. Of that $4 trillion, about $1.3 trillion will outlay in 2023. The rest will go on to a third or fourth or fifth year. So while the budget requested $5.9 trillion, we only expect $5.8 trillion or so to actually leave the Treasury this year. If you are running an agency or running a program office within an agency, you care about this new authority because those are the contracts you can write. Those are the people you can hire. If you're the Treasurer of the United States, you care about the outlays because that's the cash you need to have on hand to pay the government's bills. Here is a line showing the growth in gross domestic product for the United States in inflation-adjusted dollars. And you can see that our economy has grown about sixfold in the last 6 decades. This green line is how much we've spent on national defense. Now, because the scale on this chart goes up to $30 trillion, the little inset shows that there's actually a fair amount of variability in the defense budget that's just lost, given this big scale. So with all of this additional wealth, the country has devoted part of that spending to expanded social programs, education, healthcare, those kinds of things. And that's shown but with the blue line. What drives social spending in a society is similar to what drives spending in a private household. If you assume a multi-generational household with a set of parents, some children, and maybe an elderly parent or grandparent living in the house, the children and the elderly tend to be dependent on the income from those of working age. We have a similar dynamic in society where that private household pays taxes to pay for society's public goods and individualized goods. The pure public goods and services would be things like highways and national defense and the administration of the court system. But then there are individualized goods and services, such as education, such as Social Security and Medicare. And we find that at the individual level, there are more goods and services for the two extremes of the age population, children and the elderly. So the age structure of a society is really important in terms of the demand for public services. If we were to look at the age structure of the United States in what's called a population pyramid, each bar represents a 5-year age group. We can see in the box here, the working age population is pretty substantial compared to the two ends, which is a healthy shape for a population pyramid. And there's a lot of concern about the aging baby boomers putting stress on the system. But the good news is the baby boomers had lots of babies. In fact, the generations after the baby boomers are larger than the baby boomer generation. So long as they remain gainfully employed and pay their taxes, the retirement of the boomers should not be a major stress on the budget. So the next point, looking at these last several slides, is that as the nation's income has grown, more of that income has been devoted to healthcare and income security, social programs, relative to, but not necessarily at the expense of, national security. We also note the pandemic was an historically unprecedented use of fiscal policy to address a non-war problem, and continued growth is necessary to meet our social and financial obligations. So where does the money come from that our national government spends? Well, for about the last 40 years, 80% of the revenue that's come into the federal government, you can read on your pay stub. It's your income tax that's withheld and your payroll taxes. The remaining 20% is mostly commercial activity. Corporate income taxes, excise taxes, customs and tariffs, those kinds of things, plus some estate and gift taxes. Before about 1960, 40% or more of the taxes were coming from commercial sources. So there's been a shift in the allocation of federal tax revenue away from more commercial type activity and onto individuals and their income. So who pays taxes in America? Well, pretty much everybody does. If you think of taxes holistically, of all types at all levels of government, federal, state, local taxation, of income, of wages, of property, of consumption, what we find is the tax system is mildly progressive. That is, the highest earners, the top 1%, pay a little bit more in taxes than they earn in income. The top 1% earn 21% of the nation's income and pay 24% of the nation's taxes. You compare that to the middle 20% that earned 11% of the income, paid 9.5% of the taxes, and the lowest 20% who earned less than 3% of the income and paid 2% of the taxes. So while an individual tax, such as federal income tax, may look very progressive, that progressivity is offset by many regressive taxes throughout our system. And if you look holistically, taxes in America are pretty even. Another point that's important to make, particularly as we look at defense and national security spending, is that those functions, those policy areas, are overwhelmingly federal. Other policy areas in our society, such as healthcare or education, see funding coming from multiple sources. And if you see the note here on the slide, if you worked in a public school or a county hospital or for a transportation agency, you would be juggling multiple pots of money that arrive at different points in the year, have different expirations, different sets of rules, and the funding can become very complex. Okay, so let me redraw this line with GDP, defense, and social spending and add one more line. That red line is the national debt. So while our GDP has grown quite a bit, and we've devoted part of that to social spending, what we have not done is tax sufficiently to cover all of that spending. And you'll notice there's about 3 periods of time here on this chart. The first 20 years or so, the red line is pretty flat, meaning as the nation grew, the burden of our national debt was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that debt we were still paying down our World War II debt at this point. We were growing faster than we were spending. Then you could look at kind of a middle period here, say from the early 80s to about 2008 or so, where the lines seemed to run in parallel. We were taking on new debt at the pace we were growing. And theoretically, a country growing at, say, 3% a year can run a 3% deficit every year and not increase the burden of the national debt so long as interest rates are stable. But then you notice the period from about 2008 to today, the red line is growing faster than the black line, and we are taking on debt faster than we are growing as a country, and you cannot do that forever. So what's driving this? There's a couple of things. One of the sources of income is our payroll tax, right? And we have three big programs that are paid for by that payroll tax: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And as the country has grown, the amount of revenue coming in that payroll tax has grown along with it. The problem is the spending has not been consistent with the taxes that have come in. And we can see from this inset what's been going on here. From 1960 to 1990 or so, those 30 years, the payroll taxes covered all of the expenses, but only because we raised those payroll taxes repeatedly. Every couple of years, we were increasing the payroll tax rate. And around 1990, collectively as a society, whether we did it deliberately or just by default, we decided enough is enough and we're not going to raise that tax anymore. Yet we continued to expand the pool of beneficiaries and the size of the benefit for these programs. If you were to look at the space between these lines, that gap between the outlays and the tax revenue, that is nearly half of the national debt. If we were to look at all spending for the federal government, not just the payroll tax and these three programs, the blue line is the money going out the door in outlays. The green line is the money coming in revenues. You'll note there have only been 4 surplus budgets in the last 50 years. The other 46 have been deficits. Contrast that to the period between 1900 and 1970, where there were 30 surplus budgets. And also consider what went on in those 70 years. We had a Great Depression and 2 world wars. You'll also notice in 2008-2009, during the Great Recession, we had the largest deficit ever since World War II anyways, a $1.4 trillion deficit. And we had the highest level of spending since World War II. That triggered deficit control legislation. You may have heard of the Budget Control Act and the term sequestration as the enforcement device for the Budget Control Act that was put in place to help narrow that gap. And you can see the gap was narrowed. It worked. Similar to the deficit control legislation that was passed in the mid-late 80s, brought us to those surplus budgets by the late 90s. But those large deficits at the period of the Great Recession were eclipsed during the pandemic, where we had a $3 trillion deficit in 2020, $2.8 trillion deficit in 21, and a projection of a $1.2 trillion deficit in 2022. If we look at the entire federal debt held by the public, going back to the beginning of the last century, you see an increase during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, paying that down up to the 1980s, when we began this period of spending faster than we were growing. The projection for the future is not good. This projection is based on current law, and we always have the opportunity to change that law. So what's the structure of this debt? Well, as of the end of April of 2022, the total federal debt's $30.3 trillion. The debt held by the public, which is the part that economists worry about, is just short of $24 trillion. The rest is what's called intragovernmental holdings. So part of our national debt, we just owe to ourselves. We took money out of our left pocket and put it in our right pocket. And the Social Security Trust Fund has $2.7 trillion in it. A Civil Service Retirement Fund has close to $1 trillion, and the Military Retirement Fund has a little more than $1 trillion. So on the right side of the chart, the debt held by the public, almost a third of that is foreign held, $7.6 trillion. Japan holds the most, $1.2 trillion. China, $1 trillion, then the UK and Ireland. A lot of this debt is not held by the central governments. It's important to understand that. It's held by insurance companies. It's held by banks. It's held by pension funds. It's held by organizations like that. Domestically held is 68%, not 78%. I should fix this chart. And of that, a good chunk of it is held by the Federal Reserve. And in fact, the Federal Reserve's piece has grown significantly in the last couple of years. So let's think about the Federal Reserve here. They are the nation's central bank. And among other things, their mission is to conduct the nation's monetary policy by influencing money and credit conditions, think the amount of money in circulation and interest rates, in the economy in pursuit of full employment and stable prices. So if the Fed is doing a perfect job, we have high employment and low inflation. And they do this by expanding and contracting the money supply. Okay? So for them to have bought U.S. Treasury debt without selling off any other assets, they have to expand the money supply. And what we see is in the last 3 years, as we spent a lot of money, had to borrow a lot of money for the response to the pandemic, the Federal Reserve actually issued $2.6 trillion in new currency. And when you issue a lot of new currency, that creates inflationary pressure. And sure enough, at the time of the recording of this video, inflation is a problem right now. Notice that this increase in the monetary base started during the recession of 2008-2009 during the housing crisis. And you may have heard the term quantitative easing in the financial news. Quantitative easing was the Federal Reserve issuing new debt, buying up toxic mortgages, buying federal debt in order to hold interest rates down to help the economy recover. They did the same thing during COVID to keep the economy from crashing. Lately in the news, we've heard of quantitative tightening. This is where the Federal Reserve will sell off these assets, which is likely to have upward pressure on interest rates in the hopes of taming the higher inflation. So the size of the national debt is not the big problem. It's the ability to service that debt. And so what we see on this chart and on the blue line is the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury note at the end of each year. And the red line is interest payments as part of the budget, as a percent of the overall federal budget. And you notice where we are today, interest payments as a percent of federal outlays is historically low because interest rates are historically low. And the table shows that in just a 20-year period, the federal debt increased 3.5-fold, but interest payments actually fell because interest rates had fallen so dramatically from the mid-90s to 2015. And so the size of the debt's not the problem. Servicing that debt is the problem. The little star here on the right-hand side of the graph is where interest rates are at the time I'm recording this video in June of 2022. If interest rates continue to rise, that red line necessarily has to go up. The interest payments that we make are going to rise and will take up a larger and larger share of the federal budget. So, the next point. From the founding of the country to the 1970s, debt was incurred during wartime and recessions, and we ran surpluses at other times to reduce the debt burden. Now, we have always had some debt since the 1830s. So having a national debt is not a problem. It's the size of the debt and the ability to service it. Now, for the last 40 years, that behavior that we were doing for the first 200 years of the country shifted a bit, and structural deficits caused debt to grow steadily, even during good economic times. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if we are using that extra funding responsibly. We're not taking it on faster than we're growing. In the last dozen years or so, the Fed has monetized the debt to hold interest rates low and stimulate the economy, and the consequences of that are currently a debate, and some in that debate say the inflationary pressures we're feeling today are the result of this monetizing of the debt and the expansion of the money supply. Now let's turn our attention to spending for national security. This table shows the last decade of national security spending. Starting on the left, we have DoD, budget function 051, so this is just the military part of national security. And it's grown from $585 billion to $784 billion, or about a 3% per year compound growth rate. The next four columns actually deal with the intelligence community, which is broken into two pieces. The green column, the MIP, is the military intelligence program, which I have subtracted out from the DoD column. And then there is the NIP, which are the non-DoD elements of our national security of our national intelligence program, such as the CIA. Total IC, total intelligence community, is the sum of the MIP and the NIP. And we see that that's grown from about $65 billion in 2013 to $90 billion in 2023, about a 3.5% per year growth rate. The red column is State Department and International Affairs. That's grown faster than any of the other categories, and you note that it goes up and down depending upon what's going on in the world and what nations we're supporting and how we're supporting them. Homeland Security varies even more than International Affairs does. A large part of the Department of Homeland Security is FEMA, and we've had years with more or less natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires that need to be dealt with. And you notice also the COVID response there in 2020 and 2021 impacts on the transportation industry and other things that they did in response to the pandemic. And then the other column includes a lot of other things, international crime prevention, immigration, Commerce Department, and international trade protection. Those kinds of things have grown fairly steadily. Bottom line, we spend about $1 trillion a year on national security, which works out to be about 20% of the overall federal budget. So let's look at national defense measured in three ways. The green line represents spending, outlays, money actually leaving the Treasury, in inflation-adjusted dollars. And you notice a cyclical pattern here, with a peak corresponding to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Reagan buildup, the war on terrorism, and our current increase with our strategy of great power competition. The blue line is defense spending as a percent of GDP. You could think of that as what share of the nation's economic output is devoted to protecting that economic output. And we see that that amount has gone from about 15% during the Korean War down to about 4% today. The red line is national defense's share of the overall federal budget. This is the same as the green field in the first sand chart that I showed you with the shares of the federal budget over time. That can be interpreted as, if government is what government spends, government used to be over 50% national defense. Government is now only about 14% national defense. That peak in 2011 was the highest defense budget since World War II. If you are a critic of a large military, you would point to that and say, holy cow, why do you guys need so much money? Alternative facts, if you are a strong supporter of a powerful military, you would point to 2020 and say, wow, that's the lowest share of our federal budget devoted to defense ever. So we obviously have the capacity to spend more. Both true statements, right? We are spending a lot in terms of dollars and purchasing power, but we're spending little in terms of the share of our federal government or the share of our economy. Going to leave that green line up there. And note that every one of the budgets in the last 2 decades has been larger than historical peaks, than the peak of the Reagan buildup, the peak of the Vietnam War, peak of the Korean War. There are half as many people in uniform today as there were in the mid-'80s. The Navy's half the size it was in terms of ship count. So why does the budget feel so constrained? If we look at the forecast, this is from the Congressional Budget Office, we see the defense budget has tended to grow about 3% above inflation, and that trend is expected to continue if our current inflation is indeed transitory. The lower right chart shows that operation and support costs tend to grow faster than acquisition costs. Let's now look at some trends and allocations within the defense budget. One of the drivers of defense spending in America is public opinion. If the general public feels that we are spending too much on defense, the defense budget will trend downward. If they don't think we're spending enough, it will trend up. This graph plots public opinion polls. Where the bar points up, there is broad public support for higher defense spending, and the longer the bar, the stronger that support. When the bar points down, public opinion polls request less defense spending. They think we're spending too much. A neutral position is about -10 on this chart. The red line is the change in the defense budget the following year, the year after the poll was taken, because if public opinion is something today, it'll be next year's budget that's affected. And we find a very high correlation here, 0.59, which is unheard of in social science. Most recent data, the 2022 poll, was taken just before Russia invaded Ukraine, and it was higher than the 21 poll, which was higher than the 2020 poll. And sure enough, we see the defense budget rising in 2023, so the pattern is still holding. Let's look at the defense budget broken down by military department. And by department, we mean Navy includes Marine Corps and Air Force includes Space Force. Here's the Army budget. And we see the same cyclical pattern that we see with the overall DoD top line. But you'll notice that the peaks and valleys are much more pronounced than the overall defense budget. The peaks are higher, the valleys are lower. Contrast that to the Navy budget, which looks more like the overall DoD budget, with peaks and valleys in the same places. And the Air Force budget is very similar to the Navy budget, with the exception of the 1950s, where it had the preponderance of the responsibility for building our nuclear arsenal. What you should note here is that during periods of hot war, Korea, Vietnam, war on terrorism, the Army budget is the largest of all the services. During periods of Cold War and relative peace, the Army budget is smaller than the Navy and the Air Force. And this is largely driven by the nature of the services. The Navy and Air Force are very capital intensive. The Army is very people intensive. They can add and subtract people fairly quickly, faster than the Navy and the Air Force can add or subtract capital equipment. The Navy and the Air Force also tend to be forward deployed more than the Army. And Army and garrison is relatively cheap, and Army on the move and fighting gets very, very expensive very quickly. But this isn't the whole picture. We need to add this purple line, which are the defense-wide accounts. This pays for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, all the defense-wide field activities and agencies. And we see that that is taking a bigger and bigger and bigger chunk of the defense budget. And to the extent that those agencies and activities are removing a burden from the services and creating some efficiencies, this is a good thing. So the myth that the budget is simply split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is just not true. So now let's look at the budget broken down by appropriation title. This line is military personnel, and we see peaks again at Korea and Vietnam. We see a decline after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was the call for the peace dividend. We see spending on military personnel go down, and then right after 9/11, we brought a lot of those people back. We see here in the red line operation and maintenance spending. And notice that that is growing steadily. We see our peaks during periods of high operational tempo, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and the war on terrorism. But the underlying trend is upward. And part of what explains the relationship between the red line and the blue line is that we have substituted quite a few military personnel for civilians or contractors. And so when we move the money from a uniformed person to a contractor or a government person, we're shifting money from that blue line to the red line. We also have equipment that's much more expensive to operate and maintain. Green line is procurement, and notice that it also has its ups and downs, but it's a much more jagged line than O&M and mil-pers. Given a incremental increase or decrease to the defense budget, it's much simpler to add quantities of missiles or vehicles or aircraft or subtract an incremental amount than it is to add people or installations. And so procurement tends to be more volatile. R&D has risen steadily over time as we have more and more integrated systems and more complex systems. Construction and housing is a pretty minor part of the overall budget. What this chart depicts is the Department of the Navy forecasted budget going back 20-some years. The solid black line is what the Navy actually got. And what we see are three distinct periods of time. From 2002 to 2011, the base budgets were slightly larger than requested, and then there was OCO money, war money, on top of that. Then we went for an 8-year period where the requests for continued growth were not realized, and budgets were less than requested compressed by the Budget Control Act. Since 2018, budgets have met or exceeded expectations. And so the bottom line here is sometimes you get what you expect, sometimes less, sometimes more, and that out-year budget plans are inherently unreliable. And when we talk about budgeting in our PPBE system, we'll talk about what we have to do with that rolling 5-year plan in these environments after 2011. The environment before 2011 was sort of the ideal perfect world where we were getting as much money as we expected and we could carry out those plans. Those other periods of time, we either had to defer plans or accelerate plans. And once we're given funding, that funding's not stable. We can and do move money around. This diagram shows the dollar amount of reprogramming actions, where we take money from one account and move it to another account during the year of execution. And over that period of time, on average, we moved $20 billion between accounts. If you included below threshold reprogrammings, it would be a few $billion more. So just because Congress has appropriated money in a particular way doesn't mean that's where it's ultimately going to be spent. We have the flexibility to move it when we need to. So this next point then, defense spending is not stable. It's cyclical. It's influenced by national security and domestic demands. We notice capital-intensive services tend to have flatter budgets than the people-intensive ones. MILPERS costs overall have been pushed down relative to other costs, but they've risen on a per capita basis. If we don't have a lot of junior enlisted sailors cutting the grass, manning the gate, cooking the food, and we have contractors doing that instead, then the officer enlisted ratio goes up and the average cost per uniform member goes up. Procurement spending is more volatile than the others. Out-year budget numbers can be unreliable, and execution year funds can and many times should be moved around. Let's now talk about the fact that we don't always get our appropriation on time. And what this chart is showing are the number and duration of continuing resolutions or temporary spending authority by fiscal year. And it's important to note here that first, 75% of these years, the appropriation was late. And when it was late, it averaged 112 days and went as long as 220 days. Meaning that there's a 75% probability, if this trend continues, that we will not have all of our authorities until sometime in January of each year. This disrupts the ability to plan and manage the defense budget. But it's not just the length of the time before we get the ultimate appropriation that's a problem, it's the number of continuing resolutions that impact things. So if you look at a year like 2008 or 2013, if you ignore the shutdown, there was one continuing resolution, and we could plan for that. We knew in 2008, 45 days, we make 45 days worth of plans, we have the ultimate appropriation, off we go. Even in 2013, we knew at the beginning of the year, okay, we have 6 months worth of money, we can go do 6 months worth of things. But if you look at 2011, there were 7 continuing resolutions. So if you had assumed we wrote a contract for, say, garbage disposal on a fiscal year basis, we would have had to have written a contract for the first 70 days, and then another contract for about 20 days, and then another contract for a week, and then another one for 60, 70 days, and another one for 2 weeks. It's really disruptive, and it causes us to repeat administrative tasks, and repeating administrative tasks introduce errors and cost money. So this is disruptive. Now, is this a recent problem due to the political divisiveness in Congress? Well, I went back 50 years to look at the timeliness of authorization and appropriation acts. Authorizations are in blue. If the bar points to the left, it was enacted before 1 October. If it bar goes to the right after 1 October, and the length of the bar is how much earlier or later. And you see that the preponderance of them were late. The red bars are appropriation acts. And over that 50-year period, they were each late about 80% of the time. And more than half the time, the authorization came out after the appropriation, when the process is designed to go the other way around, with the authorization coming first. So, no, this is not a recent problem, although recently they have been longer. So if we take the 50-year view, we see that the appropriation typically arrives in mid-December. If you take the 10-year view, 20-year view, it tends to arrive in mid-January. So this chart is showing the tardiness of the defense appropriation, the state foreign affairs appropriation, and the Homeland Security appropriation. And historically, defense enjoyed priority in the appropriations process. It was almost always the first to be awarded if you went back and looked at the 70s, 80s, 90s. But if you look at the last 13 years, 10 of those 13 years, the defense appropriation was awarded the same day as state and Homeland Security, and in a lot of cases, all of the rest of the federal government. And so defense is not enjoying that priority that we once had. So what's the point? The point is there's little incentive for Congress to pass the authorization and appropriation bills on time. That's a topic for another day. But managers should expect to receive appropriations late and to make plans accordingly. Then it means we should not be scheduling things that require new authority in the first quarter of the fiscal year. Those things that require new authority include starting production or increasing the quantity of production, pay raises or increases to the number of people that we have, changing organizational relationships, new programs or new beneficiaries to existing programs, or shutting something down. All typically require congressional authority. Okay, so some questions for you to ponder before we meet as a class. Is mandatory spending crowding out national security spending? Is the growth in O&M crowding out procurement? Why does defense dominate national security spending compared to intelligence, diplomacy, international affairs, and homeland security? Defense leaders often ask Congress for more stability in defense spending. What's that mean? What does stability look like to you? What do you think causes these late appropriations? And do you think that can be remedied? And how can the effects be moderated besides what I just suggested? Is there any significance to the fact DoD does not seem to enjoy priority in the appropriations process anymore? What do you think that means? Does the size or makeup of the national debt concern you? And if it does, why? And do you think the U.S. should have a balanced budget requirement? And if we did, what would that requirement look like? Would the budget have to be balanced every year? Or maybe over a rolling 5 or 7 year period? Or over an economic cycle? Or maybe we define it as the budget can be no bigger than a certain percentage of GDP. What do you think? Give these some thoughts. We'll talk about them when we get together in class. Thanks for watching.